The mission is simple: to help high achievers naturally eliminate emotional and physical obstacles so they can optimize their life for higher achievement. Welcome. You have just entered the Genesis Zone. Good day and welcome to the Genesis Zone show. This is Dr. Brian Brown. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule on this beautiful Thursday. Have you ever suffered from a traumatic event? And it could be something as severe as sexual abuse or physical abuse, or it could be something like being present when someone was abused or died. Or it could be simply neglect or abandonment. Did you have symptoms associated with those post-traumatic stress disorder issues, such as sadness, anxiety, memory difficulties, unexplained pain, nightmares, or flashbacks? Well, scientists have discovered how trauma experiences actually accelerate aging. But better yet, they may be very close to a solution for this problem. So stay tuned as we kind of dive into that and discover more about this topic. In the United States alone, 6% of the population will struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder at any point in time. And this is the adult population, actually. This translates to about 12 million adults per year. Now, sadly, having practiced psychiatry now for 23 years, I estimate that these numbers are exceptionally low for adult reporting, because traumatic events actually follow you your entire life. And the most recent information we have is that about 2/3 of children, it's an astounding number, I know, but 2/3 of children report at least one traumatic event prior to the age of 16 years. Now, that's about 34.8 million children based on the Adverse Childhood Events Study, or ACEs study, one of the longest ongoing trauma studies in the world. It's been going on for decades now. And if that's not scary enough, the ACEs study has also found that 5 out of 10 of the leading causes of death are associated with adverse childhood events. Now, there's a discrepancy there. If only 12 million adults per year are reporting trauma or PTSD, yet we have about 34.8 million children per year that are affected by trauma and have these adverse childhood events and subsequent PTSD. And if it's not resolved in childhood, which most of it does not get resolved in childhood, then we carry it into adult years, then the adult reporting is exceptionally low. And we have to pay attention to the ACEs data, because when you look at the fact that 5 out of 10 of the leading causes of death are associated with adverse childhood events, that's significant. It's astronomical, actually. Just to give you a little further perspective on what I'm talking about, if we could prevent adverse childhood events from occurring in the first place, that would translate to a decrease in adult depression conservatively by at least 44%. So what does all this mean in relation to today's topic of accelerated aging? Well, without being sarcastic or snarky, if 5 out of 10 of the leading causes of death are associated with adverse childhood events, post-traumatic stress disorder, then it makes sense that those adverse childhood events leading to those 50% of the main causes of death in America, that they accelerate aging, such as heart disease, stroke, heart attacks, diabetes, obesity, depression, so on and so forth. They all lead to accelerated aging. But why? Well, we've not really understood that until now. Actually, there was a study published in Molecular Psychiatry on July the 22nd of this year. And Israeli researchers studied a very large group of military personnel who had known diagnoses of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, aside from the usual higher incidences of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse that we quite often see as consequences of trauma, they found something quite interesting in their biomarker analysis of these PTSD survivors. Now, the biomarkers that they looked at, and they looked at numerous ones, but they found 4 previously unstudied gut bacteria levels that were noted to be severely low in these trauma survivors. Interestingly, there was a kind of a seesaw reaction where they saw these low levels in these 4 unstudied bacteria. They saw high levels of bacteria called, and it's a classification of Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes. You don't have to remember those names. Just know that we've been aware of Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes. You may have actually heard some of the data over the past, 2 or 3 years related to these 2 groups of bacteria as they relate to obesity. And you've actually seen some higher level research centers. It's not mainstream practice, but higher level research centers are actually doing fecal transplant in morbidly obese children to change their ratios of Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes. But in this particular study, these 4 previously unstudied bacteria were too low, and the Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes were too high. Now, the reduction of these 4 types of bacteria and the elevation of the other 2 were associated with symptoms like worsening of intrusive thoughts. Now, intrusive thoughts are the process by which these thoughts interject into your mind. These very pessimistic, very negative, very doomsday type thoughts interject into your mind, and you can't do anything about them. They're just there, and you obsess about them. So those changes in the levels of those gut bacteria were associated with worsening of intrusive thoughts. They were also associated with worsening of hyperarousal states. We might call that hypervigilance, meaning you're on constant alert all the time. You're kind of looking over your shoulder. It's easy to call that paranoia. It's not paranoia. It's an anxiety state. But this hyperarousal state means you're on constant high alert at all times. And these changes in the bacteria were also associated with worsening of reactivity to stressful situations. And this was just a few of them, but those were the 3 biggies that they saw in this particular study associated with these bacteria imbalance. And for those who received a successful treatment of their PTSD and did not have the symptoms that I just mentioned, they had the opposite presentation. Those 4 previously unstudied bacteria were actually normal or normal high levels, and the Bacteroides and Firmicutes actually had low levels. Now, here's where it gets really, really interesting. Another one of the biomarkers they found was associated with energy production in your body. Now, as I've previously discussed, our body is an energetic powerhouse. In fact, you've probably heard me talk about mitochondria and CoQ10 or coenzyme Q10 as being part of these energy pathways, and that we can actually check genetics related to these mitochondria pathways to see how healthy they are. Well, dialing down even further in this energy production pathway, there's an enzyme involved in energy production that has been found to be associated with, guess what, premature or accelerated aging when its levels are too low. Now, this enzyme is called, and you don't need to remember the name of this. I'm just telling you for the sake of this podcast. The enzyme is called transaldolase. Now, we call it TAL for short. Now, TAL we've been aware of it for a long time. You've heard of oxidative stress. It's when cellular respiration occurs, in other words, energy production and activity of the cells occur, we create free radicals. Okay. This is on the non-oxidative side of the energy pathway, but it's still in the energy pathway. And researchers in the study found that TAL was drastically reduced in trauma survivors with the highest states of that hyper arousal and reactivity to stressful situations. So, in other words, the people who were in this constant fight or flight most often had the lowest levels of TAL. And as such, the assumption is that because of these extremely low levels of TAL, these particular trauma survivors were at the greatest risk for accelerated aging. And I would dare add, and it was not brought out in the study, they're also at accelerated risk for, guess what? Go back to the ACEs study, those five common causes of death in the United States. So if we're accelerating aging, we're accelerating illness. And I'm talking about physical illness, not mental illness, physical illness. So the two go hand in hand. Now, the clinical implications here are huge, but the possibilities for improvement are even bigger. Now, I'll have to admit, technology is going to have to catch up just a little bit. Testing for TAL is only done in research settings at this point. However, this particular study has brought to light the importance of TAL in a clinical setting. We've never understood it like we have until now. So I hope that soon we will have a commercially available test for TAL. I mean, think about this. What if you had a police officer or a fireman or a paramedic or an ER physician or an ER nurse who are constantly exposed to trauma, or military personnel that are constantly exposed to trauma, and you were making the decision of whether you wanted to leave them on the battlefront, so to speak, or pull them back into a job where they weren't exposed to so much trauma, then you would want to check these TAL levels. And if the TAL levels are too low, then that means their PTSD symptoms are worse, and they're more likely to have health consequences, more likely to have accelerated aging. So we would pull them back into jobs where they didn't have to be on the front line, so to speak, and we could wait for their TAL levels to return to healthy levels before we put them back into frontline type of action. Now, that's just one possible implication for the use of a commercially available TAL lab, but I think we will see it used for that in clinical settings soon. And when I say soon, in the next few years. Now, there are commercially available tests for gut bacteria, but to my knowledge, the four previously unresearched bacteria, they don't even have names right now. They just have numbers. Those bacteria have no tests for them outside of a research setting. We do have commercial tests for Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes, but not the other four. But that's an easy fix, really it is. And I think hopefully available, we'll see available soon, these tests for those other four kind of oddball bacteria that we've not previously looked at. In the meantime, what can we do? And that's a really important question. Well, we can test gut bacteria for the things that we can check for. We can test for Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes balance. And if we see that these levels are too high, then there are things that we can actually do from a functional medicine standpoint to help rebalance those levels. All that being said, a good gut health hygiene program needs to be followed by everyone on a daily basis anyway. In other words, you need to guard what goes into your mouth. There are certain foods that we need to gravitate towards, and there are certain foods that we need to stay away from. Taking a good, solid, well-rounded probiotic and then balancing with other very specific probiotics as needed to get imbalances corrected. Now, in addition to that, nutritionally supporting our neurological system so that the PTSD symptoms may not be quite as severe, so that the health consequences that can be triggered because of PTSD may not be quite as severe or may not be present at all. Again, there needs to be some research done on that, but we know we can nutritionally support the neurological system and the body simply by starting with DNA first. And quite frankly, I mean, just where I come from in clinical practice and what I've seen in clinical practice, by starting with DNA first, it's probably more important than the former. Now, you're going to have your gut balance people that are going to argue that, but I can actually look at DNA and see what you're prone to with gut imbalances anyway. But all that being said, when we're looking at DNA and how we can nutritionally support your DNA throughout your entire body and brain and your neurological system, we're looking at things that we can help modify, such as inflammation and detoxification, methylation, mitochondria function, and neurotransmitter function. And if we don't necessarily, I believe this, if we don't start with DNA first, then I believe that our boat is sunk before we ever leave the dock clinically when we're developing a treatment plan. That's why I start with genetics first in everybody that I work with. That's all I've got for today. If you would like to discuss this further, or you're kind of already on board, you've been following me for a while, and you're curious to know what it would take to get started, even checking your DNA, message me on Facebook or Instagram at Dr. Brian G. Brown. I'll be glad to show you, the process and the next steps that you need to kind of get started. Tune in next Thursday at noon Eastern Standard Time for our next In the Zone segment, where we'll be talking about my insights about the latest research as it pertains to optimizing your physical and emotional health, as it pertains to optimizing your genes, your DNA, because as I said, that's critical. Most informed, most trusted, and most grateful you spent this time with us today. Until next time, stay in the zone. I'm Dr. Brian Brown.